Welcome to Bake to the Future. The wholesale baking industry mixes tradition and innovation to feed the world and the economy, generating some major dough while employing nearly 800,000 people in the U.S. We bring you a fresh take on the latest trends and issues impacting the baking sector through exclusive insights and conversations. Brought to you by the American Bakers Association, who will take you bake to the future.
Hi, welcome to Bake to the Future. I'm Haley Blumenreich.
And I'm Katie Joel.
And today we are thrilled to have some familiar faces from ABA back with us today. Lee Sanders, Senior Vice President of Government Relations and Public Affairs, and Kelly Knowles, Vice President of Political and State Affairs here at ABA. They will be talking with Jim Ellis, Senior Political Analyst for the Business Industry Political Action Committee, also known as BIPAC.
With the 2020 election right around the corner, we're grateful to have them here with us to break down what we can expect from this election and what the results might mean for the baking industry. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us here today.
Well, it's great to be here. I'm always happy to talk to folks who produce some of my favorite foods.
Yes, indeed. And before we hand over the reins, Haley, can you tell us a little bit more about Jim?
Sure. So Jim Ellis, he analyzes electoral politics and reports upon trends, characteristics, and tendencies in the American elections for political action committees, associations, and legislative advocacy firms. Jim speaks around the country on electoral politics, and most recently, he spoke at an ABA event, the Next Gen Baker Virtual Leadership Forum.
And before we get to the show, we must ask Jim and our guest host, Kelly and Lee, our great bake debate question. So this is a new feature that we're having on the show where we ask a question that is a little bit tricky to answer. So how many seconds do you hold a cookie in the milk when dipping? 1 second for a quick dip or 5 seconds for more of a soak? Jim, what do you think?
Oh, quick.
Okay. All right. So
one second for me.
Okay. Okay. What about Kelly, Lee? Expert opinion from you guys.
I'm with Jim. Quick.
And I am a 5 second girl, so I would soak it.
All right. Got the soggy cookie over there. And actually, before we really hand over the reins and get into the show, Jim, I don't think we've had you on the show before. In fact, I know we haven't. And we also we have a hardball question before we start. What is your favorite baked good?
Well, my mom's German chocolate cake that have been replicated by many of your members was one of my favorite things and was always my favorite at birthday. So the German chocolate cake and with carrot cake being a close second. And I've had some really, really good baked carrot cakes from many of your members, I'm sure.
All right. Well, excellent. Well, thank you for that, Jim, and thank you for your insights on the Great Bake Debate. Haley, can listeners weigh in as well?
Yes. Although Lee and Kelly have both been in the baking industry for decades, they're not the only opinions, along with Jim's, that we care about. We want to hear from you as well. So our listeners can share their opinion with us at baketothefuture.org/debate and stick around to the end for the end of the show where we reveal to you the results of our previous Great Bake Debates. Now on to Kelly and Lee and Jim.
Hey, Katie, Haley, thanks so much. And welcome, Jim. Well, let's just jump right in. We've got some great discussion today, and we look forward to having some banter with you, Jim. Our first question, Congress has failed to pass the fourth stimulus package for COVID-19 relief. How do you think this matters to voters? We're 35 days out from the election.
Right.
What do you think?
I think people, including me, are so confused as to what they're doing with all of this relief package. And every day it seems to be a new story coming out of Washington. And I'm not sure at this point it's going to have a major effect on the electoral outcome because I think my guess is people are confused by it. And when they are confused, they tend to discount and go back to their normal voting trends. So my guess is right now, and if you'd asked me this question when it first started, when we first went into the shutdown back in March and April, I think it would have been totally different than it is today. But right now, I don't think it's going to have as great an effect. The economy seems to be overtaking COVID as the number one issue now. And of course, we have all of the unrest in America's cities. Those two seem to be moving ahead of COVID in terms of a determinative factor in how people are voting.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've always heard it's the economy, stupid. Do you think the economy ranks for voters as the very top issue?
Well, certainly President Trump hopes it does. Mm-hmm. And the latest polling indicates that it is back as number one as to who is better positioned to move the economy forward. Most polling indicates that Trump is the choice for that. Biden is the clear choice if it was COVID and healthcare. And so we're really getting into, I think, two separate issue areas that each campaign will try to drive this to. Trump will try to drive the campaign to economy and the unrest in America's cities. Biden wants to stay on COVID and healthcare.
I agree, Jim. Hey, this is Kelly. It's great to be with you today. Before we get into our next question, I just wanted to say what a terrific resource you personally are to the ABA and our members in your role at BIPAC. And just for our listeners, BIPAC is an organization that works to mobilize corporate employees and educate companies on, how Washington, D.C. impacts their day-to-day operations, much like ABA. And so your role at BIPAC, tell us a little bit about what you do there. And I'm going to comment on what a great resource you are for us.
Oh, well, thank you so much. So for the BIPAC members, and then I also have other companies who aren't BIPAC members that I do provide services for, but I analyze the elections and I work through and put out daily reports on what is happening in the election. Obviously, I'm quite busy right now. If I'm not, I'd be in real trouble. And so really trying to, and what I try to do for the members and people who view what you all put out to your PAC members is really something different than they're seeing in the media. And one example I can give you right now on that is I think that when you see in the major media and you watch these television shows and they talk about what states to pay attention to, and they always go to the Great Lakes because that was the area that made the difference last time. And that by that, I mean the states that touch a Great Lake, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and now Minnesota, which appears to be in play. And I think that's true to an extent. I think one of those will be determinative in what happens in the election. However, I think there's 5 states that are more important into what's going to happen in the election. And that's the southern tier states of Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina. President Trump has to win all of those. And if Joe Biden cracks into any one of them, and Arizona appears to be the most precarious for Trump right now of those 5, then Biden's probably going to win the election if he can win one of those 5. On the other hand, if Trump carries those 5, again, Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, if he takes all 5 like he did last time, and every Republican candidate must do that, not just him, then the rest of the map actually sets up pretty easily for Trump because all he would have to do then is carry one of those Great Lakes states that we mentioned, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, or Minnesota, and he wins the election again.
Right. So you're kind of getting ahead of us here because we've got some questions about specific states and outlook for the presidency. But in terms of what you do for BIPAC, I just wanted to say for our members, and so they have a good understanding, in my role at ABA, facilitating our political action committee, we're solicited by every campaign that's running for reelection. And so, a third of the Senate up every 2 years, and then, of course, the entire House of Representatives. So that's a lot of races to keep up with and make good estimations and judgments on where to engage. And so a lot of the guidance and expertise that we get from you and the folks at BIPAC really helps us make a decision about where we want to engage, along with, do candidates support our record? Do we have a presence in the state and district? And issues like that. So the work you do for us is just so terrific.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad you find it valuable. And I rely a lot on the statistics and a lot on voting behavior. We've seen, particularly in 2020, we've seen so many polls out there, and they're so different now. And I laugh with people. If you want to see a particular outcome in a state, I can probably find you a poll that will tell you what you want to see right now.
Right.
And so you really have to get beyond the polling and look at voter behavior and voter trends and voter history, which I think is very, very important. And next year, once we get through this election, then the big thing we'll have next year is redistricting under the new census numbers, assuming the census can get fully completed, which it looks like they can now. And then that's going to change all the districts in the country, and we've got a whole new set of situations to deal with then.
Right, a whole new landscape. Well, and just mentioning for our listeners so they know, we're recording this podcast on September 29th. And, sadly, recently, the legendary Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. And so the president, since that time has made the decision to nominate Amy Coney Barrett in this position. And so I want you to get your thoughts, Jim, on the impact that this whole process, the nomination, so very close to the election. I mean, really almost unprecedented. I think I heard Abraham Lincoln might have been the last time this happened so closely to an election, but I'm probably wrong about that. But talk about the impact this has, and then especially if you could highlight, just specifically drill down on the key Senate races where this issue is a factor. Specifically, I would say Susan Collins in Maine is certainly one who has indicated, that she would oppose a nomination. So I want to get your thoughts on the nomination and just that transition of power in the seat in the Supreme Court.
Well, Kelly, I think that's a really important point and question here. And it's a wild card that just came up with the unfortunate passing of Justice Ginsburg. But it's going to change the election, or could. I think it has the potential to. And a lot depends, though, on how these campaigns use that issue. There were some Senate debates here recently, and I was a little bit surprised when they answered those questions, and that was Montana, Iowa, Maine, that they didn't really zero in, I think, for Republicans, what I think could be a real opening for them, particularly in the states that are competitive, that should go their way, like Montana, like Iowa, maybe coming back a little bit in Arizona where they're trailing. And that's the issue of the Second Amendment or gun control. Polls have continually indicated that for the low propensity right of center voter, the gun control or Second Amendment issue drives those voters to the polls more than any other. And I expected that to be used more so far. And so I'm a little bit surprised that it hasn't, because I think that gives the Republican candidates, frankly, in the states that are competitive, a bigger advantage. But at this point, I haven't seen them using it like I expected. But it's still early enough where they can. But I think it really affects the races of the Supreme Court, as you mentioned, in Maine, Iowa, Montana, Alabama, and some of the southern states that have competitive elections. And so it's I think it's going to be a real key issue if it's used right. Probably the biggest beneficiary out there, who's in a tough race back at his home state in South Carolina, is Senator Lindsey Graham, who is surprisingly in an even race against Jamie Harrison, who was the former chairman of the South Carolina Democratic Party. And they've raised over $30 million in this race. And Lindsey Graham claims that with all the outside expenditures coming in against him, they'll probably spend about $80 million in a small state on this race. And the polling is indicating it's even. But Lindsey Graham, starting in the mid-October with these confirmation hearings, he's going to be running the committee as the chairman. And he's going to be on TV constantly, and he's going to be able to frame that debate, not only in terms of how it affects the nominee, Amy Coney Barrett, but frankly also how it affects his own election. And he needs something like this to pull out the victory. I think he does in the end anyway, but this certainly will help him. And I think he'll use it to his advantage.
Yeah, dialogue and communications are so key. How much more influential is social media in this election than it was 4 years ago?
I think it's greatly more influential because the platforms have increased. The use of the platforms has increased. I mean, the technology world moves so fast. I mean, we're only talking 4 years, but it's almost night and day for what people were doing with various platforms in 2016 versus today, particularly Twitter. And it's so I think it's going to have more of an influence in 2020 than it did in any other election. And we keep seeing that happen. I think in 2018 midterm, it had a great deal of influence, probably the most influence of any election in history, and will probably exceed that here in 2020.
Yeah, Twitter's not just a young person's game anymore.
No.
But
and Facebook seems to be an old person's game. My millennial daughter and son-in-law I kind of monitor them. And according to my daughter, Facebook is passé. And, so it's Instagram and all these other ones that I've never even heard of.
Well, speaking of young people, gosh, how meaningful, how different is it going to be? A lot of these campaigns, they look forward to going to the college campuses and drumming up and getting interest for those very young voters. That's not necessarily going to be they're not going to be able to have these campaign events. They're not going to be able to have that dialogue with the presidential campaigns.
Yeah.
How meaningful is this time around?
Yeah, I think it changes things a lot. And I think it's way beyond the presidential race on how that changes it. And I think that this current situation where we're not being able to see a lot of grassroots efforts because of COVID and the fact that there's so few community events now, I think that hurts challengers across the board and favors the incumbents because, a challenger needs to be out there and get him or herself known. And a lot of the ways they do that is through grassroots operations, door-to-door operations, and attending multiple community events per week. And they just don't have that opportunity in 2020. And I think that hurts them to a great degree. It's tough enough for a challenger to win any race against an incumbent. And this situation that we're all in now makes it even more difficult for them. On the other hand, we've already seen 8 U.S. House members lose their primaries to challengers, which is a very high number. And keeping in mind that the House of Representatives is a body where well over 90% of the incumbents who run for re-election win. And the fact that we've already seen 8 incumbents lose in primaries, well, is that a precursor for the fall that we could see a higher number of incumbent casualties than we normally do? Quite possibly.
Do you think that it might influence for these younger folks without that face-to-face contact, that it might impact young voter turnout?
Yes, it could. I think always the young voter turnout is a little bit hyped in terms of where it will be. The best example of that is in 2008 with Barack Obama, where they thought the youth vote would really exceed expectations. And it did for the primaries, interestingly. But really not in the general. It wasn't the highest of all time like they expected. And so I would expect it, for some of the reasons you outlined, to maybe go back to being, on the lower side. Again, keep in mind, you've got 2 candidates who are well over 70 years old running for president. So does that motivate a younger person to come out and vote? I don't know, but my guess is they're not with their peers. Because of COVID, most of them are possibly back at home with their parents or living elsewhere outside of school. There's maybe not as much interaction to encourage everybody to vote. So my guess is it's going to be a little bit on the low side among the youth.
Yeah, Jim, I think what you're zeroing in on is just that enthusiasm factor. And without a lot of that face-to-face and, in-person campaign events, that can really suffer in a campaign season. At American Bakers PAC, one of the things we do is send a lot of our PAC contributions back to our members, the folks who support our PAC, so that they can, transmit those contributions face to face, person to person, where they do business, and really gives them that, firsthand opportunity to show policymakers and candidates for Congress what it takes to run a bakery operation. And so much like everywhere else across the country, we've transitioned our efforts politically to a more digital format. So, we're having Zoom candidate meetings and,
yes.
Almost every day I'm just, it's really overwhelming and a different landscape, but nonetheless, still a meaningful opportunity. But I think the enthusiasm factor is pretty critical in this cycle. But what I want to get your expertise on next is just this whole landscape in terms of how the country is going to vote this year. And, from showing up in person to the polls, mail-in voting. We know that California, you talked about recently, their rules. So give us an overview, give listeners an overview of what voting is going to look like across the country over the next 35 days.
Well, that's a great point. And I think this is going to, frankly, the changes in election system is going to cause a lot of problems, in all honesty. And it's not going to be a good ending if the presidential election is really close. And it appears it might be. mean, Bloomberg News is estimating, and they might be right, that President Trump would likely win on election night in the in-person vote, but then Biden wins in the mail after the election with all these ballots coming in. That could well be true. Now, I think there's some problem points here. I mean, it sounds great. We're just going to go to all mail and everybody can get a chance to vote here. However, we had a lot of problems in various states during the primaries, in New York in particular, where the primary was June 23rd and they couldn't even come up with the final numbers until middle of August because they had so many mailed ballots that they weren't counting on. But you also had problems in Pennsylvania, and Maryland, and Georgia, and Nevada, and Kentucky. So it wasn't just a sort of a one-stop system. But there's one thing that the states have in common where they've had problems and where they haven't with mail. And the mail voting actually started back in 2000 with the state of Oregon, and they vote all mail. There are no in-person balloting, and that's been the case since 2000 there. And they haven't had many problems. Colorado has followed suit with that, and so does Washington and California to a large degree. But Oregon and Colorado do things that the others don't, and that is that they require the ballots to be in on Election Day. These other states, Washington and California in particular, they allow ballots to come in after the election. And now 17 other states have followed suit with that. So you've got 19 states, about 8 of which are competitive, where ballots are going to come in after the election day, assuming they are postmarked on election day. And I think this is going to cause us a great amount of trouble, because this is where we're going to get into charges and counter-charges and challenges and counter-challenges. And this is where it gets all into the judiciary, because they're going to challenge a lot of these mail ballots. Pennsylvania is the place I think it may become ground zero for 2020, because they've gone way beyond any other state. And the state Supreme Court really sort of arbitrarily changed the state's laws. Now, there are challenges to this, and they're trying to get this changed in the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm not sure how successful they'll be. But what they've done is they have extended the ballot reception period to Friday, November 6th, as other states have done too. But the difference is here, they have set up drop boxes around the counties. And so you can deposit your ballot in these drop boxes as opposed to the mailbox. And I think that could be a real problem too, because you got a real chance of stuffing them with illegal ballots. You've got a lot of charges and counter charges where those doors are going to be opened. But I think the most dangerous thing, and this Secretary of State is the only one I've seen that's done this, but the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania has issued an edict to the county clerk that they may not, that they're prohibited from verifying a person's signature on the absentee ballot with their voter registration card. And that's just going to open the door to nothing but challenges. And if it comes down to that state, and it may, we could be in for a horrendous post-election period that could drag on. And I think it's going to get real ugly if it's close. And I think all that is a mistake. If we follow the Oregon model on the ballots, I don't think there'd be any problem. They've had a lot of experience. They have 20 years of experience doing this. And this is a liberal state that does this, and they've not had the problems that other states had. And I think the key to it is because they require the ballots in on Election Day. Now, 31 states are requiring the ballots in on Election Day. There are 19 that don't. But among the 19 that don't are North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and now Wisconsin. Yeah. That's the site of where we're going to have problems at the end of the election if it's close. And I'm afraid it will be.
I mean, that's such great insight for our listeners, and particularly about Pennsylvania, which I was not aware of a lot of what you just shared.
Now there's challenges to that, and they may get that changed. But right now, that's what they're doing.
Right, and such a pivotal state as Pennsylvania. I mean, like you said, that's part of the president's path to reelection. And so, what a pivotal state that's going to come down to being. So going to put you on the spot again, looking in your crystal ball, Jim, when are we going to know? The finality of the presidential race and some of these key congressional races.
Right. And with the mail balloting beyond the presidential race, there will be tight congressional and U.S. Senate races that will go into political overtime, as I'm calling it. And so it's going to be a period of time before we know the true outcome of all of these elections. But for the presidential election, December 14th is going to be a key day. That's the day the Electoral College actually meets in the various state capitals. And that's where the votes for president are actually cast by individuals. Now, for some reason, if a state cannot name its electors, i.e. they don't have a certified election result, then we could see real problems. And if a state, let's take Pennsylvania just for an example, if they do get into a protracted situation because the election's close, and they go to and they are deadlocked and cannot name electors, then they would have no electoral votes. The chance then of either candidate getting 270 votes to win the election is probably very minimal. Meaning, and what happens then? What happens if you don't have a majority winner? Well, it goes to the House of Representatives to break the tie. And it would be done in the new House of Representatives, the one that's elected on November 3rd or beyond. So again, here we come back to, if some of those races are tied up, we could have problems there too. So, and here's the caveat about the vote for the House. People say, well, the Democrats control the House, so that would be an easy win for Biden. Actually, it's not. Because each House member for the vote for president does not have his or her own vote. It's each state has one vote. So California, with its 53 members, they get one vote for president. But places like Alaska and Montana and the Dakotas and Wyoming and Delaware and Vermont, they have one congressman. They get one vote too. So the vote for president really skews to the smaller states and the rural areas. And if the current Congress or the current House were voting on this, the Republicans actually have 26 delegations that they control versus just 22 for the Democrats, and the other two being split. So if that number holds, we could have a different outcome in the House than actually what the majority of the House would do if every member had his or her own vote. So we could have some real crazy times here.
Switching gears a little, everyone seems to have written off pickups or a flip in the House, but there's some really great candidates out there. Yeah. Interesting what you were just talking about. What do you think?
Well, I think, yes, clearly the Democrats are in good position to hold on, but it's not a total foregone conclusion. Now, if President Trump were to win and he brings the Senate back with him, and I think probably the Senate goes with whoever wins the presidential race. That's been the way it's been for the past couple of cycles. And I don't see any reason to think it won't be this time. And then what happens in the House? Well, if you get the Republican sweep there, if that happens, then it's not out of the realm of possibility. They're going to need a net gain of 19 seats. And we've had 4 elections since 1994 where the minority party has gained over 40, including 2018. And so those types of gains are not unusual. 19 seats is not a particularly huge number. And it's within grasp. As you mentioned, there are good candidates out there. On the other hand, the Democrats have really are pushing a lot of Republican incumbents too. So their chances of gaining some Republican seats are pretty good as well. So right now, Democrats certainly favored to hold the House. But we also have to keep in mind that there are 30 Democratic House members who sit in seats that President Trump won in 2016, most of which he will win again. So it's not a foregone conclusion the Democrats hold, but it's likely they do.
There's so much great information, but I want to finish with some rapid fire on some Senate races where ABA has a strong presence, both through member operations, and then a lot of these states have incumbents who are strong supporters of ABA issues and vote with us on key items critical to the industry. So I'm just going to call out the state, and I want you to tell me who you think is going to win, and let's go pretty quick. So let's start first. Maine.
I think Susan Collins actually mishandled the Supreme Court situation. I think she probably loses some conservative support that she can't afford to lose. So I would think the Democrats win that one.
North Carolina.
Thrown out more incumbents than any other state in the country. Only 2 people since 1974 have been reelected in North Carolina. Senator Tom Tillis running for a second term. He's behind in the polls. There's no question. And he's running behind Trump. So that's a bad sign for him. On the other hand, North Carolina tends to be a ticket state, and they vote president and Senate in the same party. My answer would be whoever wins the presidential race probably pulls a senator in too, and I'd favor Trump to win the state.
Colorado.
I would think the Democrat John Hickenlooper defeats Senator Cory Gardner. That state has just gone too far to the left for Gardner to win, I think, even though he's probably the best campaigner the Republicans have in the country. But I think it may be a little beyond him.
Okay, lastly, Georgia.
With the 2 seats in Georgia, I'd favor Senator David Perdue. The polling is exactly what it was for him last time. He was a little bit ahead going into the election and won by about 6 points. I think he will win. And then we had the special election on the same day with Kelly Loeffler. There's a 5-way race there. That'll go to a runoff and won't be decided until January 5th.
So what I'm hearing is a couple of net losses for GOP, but you think they're going to hold power in the Senate?
Well, I think it could come down to 1 seat, and that 1 seat may be North Carolina.
There we go.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. So much to take in there, Jim. Thank you so much for all of that information and all the stats to back it up, too. I know that this election will absolutely be unlike any other. I think that's even thinking back to the 2000 elections and the hanging chads and all of that. I think that this is a whole other ballgame. So I appreciate you giving us some insight.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, Jim.
And you can read key highlights from Jim's session from the Next Gen Baker Virtual Leadership Forum on the new ABA website, americanbakers.org.
And now for the part that you've all been waiting for. Thanks for sticking around to the end to hear the results of our previous Great Bake Debates. And our most recent one was, how do you pronounce croissant? And this one was really split. 33% said they pronounce it croissant, but then we had some write-ins with croissant, and croissant.
Croissant.
So that was
Kelly Knowles with her southern accent. Croissant.
I wonder what region of France that is from.
Southern region, probably.
Yes, so sad. And then we didn't announce yet the results from our first Great Bake Debate, which was, what is the proper way to cut a sandwich? And 33% said diagonally. 50% said perpendicular into 2 rectangles. And then one person said that, why can't you just pick it up and eat it uncut? So fair point.
Person was hungry.
Yes. But this was the perfect episode to announce all of our stat results with Jim here, since he is the guy with the numbers. And we just want to let our listeners know to answer the question for this episode about dipping a cookie in milk. And you can find that on the website at baketothefuture.org/debates.
And you can listen to Bake to the Future anywhere you can find podcasts, including Spotify, Ghana, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and more episodes are available on baketothefuture.org.
Bake to the Future is brought to you by the American Bakers Association in partnership with Human Factor. To hear upcoming and past episodes, go to baketothefuture.org. Bake to the Future is produced by Haley Blumenreich. Audio engineer is Blake Alton. And A Slice of the Action is written by the American Bakers Association's Government Relations team.